Cool. It looks like we are live according to the Zoom. Let Rachel confirm.
We are live.
Super duper. Okay, well, good morning, everyone, or evening or afternoon, depending on your locality. Proper greeting to you. My name is Jory Burson. I'm the OpenJS Foundation's community manager. And today we are asking questions about the OpenJS Foundation Impact Project, probably the impact project of all time, jQuery. And to answer those questions, I am joined by the very wonderful Dave Methvin and Timmy Willison. Dave has been a contributor to the jQuery project since 2006 and led a lot of the project initiatives over the course of his 14-year history, notably leading the releases for core versions 1.7 through 2.1. Hi, Dave. And Timmy has been a jQuery core team contributor and member since 2011, and its core team lead since 2015. He's also the lead front-end engineer at Spokestack. So as we visit today, if you have any questions for them during this AMA, please tweet them at OpenJSF on Twitter, or if you're watching the live stream, you can also use the chat functionality there. Myself and my colleague Rachel will be sure to get them asked. So hey guys, how are y'all doing this morning?
Doing great.
Right. So you know, it's kind of funny to say out loud that you have been contributing to open source since in this project specifically since 2006 and 2011. So it's jQuery's been around for like a while. So I think one of the interesting things to think about compared to a lot of other open source projects is what it takes to maintain a project that's kind of older. What are some of those challenges that kind of you face that probably other projects don't?
Timmy, you want to go first?
Sure. So I think the biggest challenge is probably backwards compatibility, where there are changes that we would like to make, but it would just break too much code in the wild because jQuery's been out for so long and it's so ubiquitous at this point. So we have to be very sensitive to that and make small incremental changes. And some changes we'll never be able to make because it would just break too much.
That mandate of don't break the web is something y'all take really seriously. Can you give some examples of some of the changes that like you have to kind of consider really carefully?
Dave, do you have something?
Yeah, just about every change we make. I think at one point, probably 10 years ago, I said every change jQuery makes is a breaking change, because regardless of whether it's documented or not, people have come to expect certain behavior, even if it's not documented, to never change. That even includes things that are security bugs. So we had a feature in Ajax that would accept the content type from a server and say, "Oh, you the server are telling us this is a script time. We'll execute it." And someone pointed out, well, that can be a security bug. You may be communicating with a somewhat untrusted site where normally you're getting text back, but if an attacker was to be able to send you script, you'd start executing it. We said, yeah, that's true, but there are people who are depending on this automatic detection of types to be able to run their real servers. And so we don't want to just go and change it in a minor release and break everybody's code. So those are the kind of dilemmas we face making any change. Is we know we're probably going to break someone's code. The only saving grace we have versus, say, a browser is that people choose whether they're going to change their version of jQuery most of the time, whereas when a browser does an update, they really have a higher risk of breaking the web.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not even about changing something that's been documented. If we have to be careful even changing things that aren't documented, that people are relying on, that we're discovering that they're relying on. Like removing jQuery.browser, for instance. There might have been a lot of people using that to sniff the user agent. And that wasn't really why it was there. It was just a convenience property for us internally. And we eventually removed it because we considered it, not the best practice to sniff the browser agent. Maybe it was, we wanted people to instead do feature tests. And was still a tough change to make because I'm sure it broke some code. People are relying on that.
Is there anything you wish you had known or thought about, like back in the day? It's probably hard to imagine, like, oh, the project I'm working on is going to be the most popular JavaScript library ever. No, that's really not.
Yeah, I don't think anybody saw that coming.
If you were able to go back in time and give yourself some advice about what to do now to prepare for maintaining it today, what do you wish you had known?
I've got a couple for that. I think the most critical advice for anyone, both for us in the past us, and also anyone creating software that is used by a lot of people, is to be very conservative in what you add, to learn how to say no in a nice way, because everything you add becomes a liability for the future. So we would quite often say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have a method to tell us whether something is a number? And we put it in, but is a sequence of 130 digits a number? Well, technically, yes, but it's not really a valid JavaScript number for many applications. So we would constantly be adding things and then regretting it later, saying, it would have been better if we had made this a plugin, something that wasn't central to the application, so that we could have disowned it or had some other plugin for the people who wanted a different behavior than we had defined.
Yeah, if I can add to that, I think if we could have known the future in terms of how the specs would evolve, there would have been a lot of things that we would have waited on and not added, or altered a little bit, because that's the way the spec was going to turn out. So jQuery kind of led the specs in that way, but they didn't always define them. And like, for instance, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but I think we have a question about deferreds. I would have liked it had we not added deferreds at all and just use native promises, but they weren't out yet. They were still being defined, and it turned out that the behavior of promises was a little bit different than what we thought they were going to be. So deferreds are still different than promises, although that's an overstatement, because we still have .then, which is completely promises compliant. But there's still an odd mixture, because .done isn't promises compliant. Yeah.
I think we just ran into a lot of situations, I think, where we were kind of ahead of the curve. Like, we were part of the process, the thinking process into creating some of these new standards. But during that process, it would come out the other end looking a little different than we had defined. But at that point, we had millions of people using our API, so we couldn't just say, oh, well, you know, for reasons of being standard, we're going to abandon all you guys and break all your code.
Mhm.
So, I mean, that's something that's a very difficult line to walk, because the only way you can kind of push things is to get it out there and let people experiment. So I don't think we would want to say, oh, we're just not going to put any of these things here. It would have been good to have a mechanism by which we could have had supported plugins or something that weren't baked right into jQuery.
Right, like even Ajax could have been a plugin because there were so many libraries already dedicated to that. And then we got Fetch,
Right.
which is largely based on jQuery.ajax.
And that's one more situation where I think also the design of our APIs, I mean, we had what I would call like internal functionality in the API. So rather than having something that exposed the critical parts that you could string together, Fetch is actually a wonderful API in this way. You know, fetch me some stuff and then try to convert it to JSON and then do this. But it's all from the outside. You're doing that. Whereas what Ajax did is it said, fetch me some stuff and I'm going to pass you a flag telling you what type I think it is or what type you should try to interpret it as. There were every time we added a feature to Ajax, we had to add more flags to it. So Ajax is by far the most complex API in jQuery because of that. And if we had been able to expose more of the raw functionality and let the user string it together, I think it would have been a much easier to use API.
But to your point, it was also pretty, groundbreaking, at the time, and the project in many ways helped push the language development, the standard development along probably more quickly than it would have, than the language would have evolved without jQuery. So, I mean, if you would, yes, you could go back in time and maybe do things a little differently, but do you think we'd have the same language that we do today, or would it look very different?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think jQuery's legacy isn't so much its popularity or like the APIs in themselves. It's how they influenced the web as a whole, and how we got query selector all, which is largely based on the selector engines, the JavaScript selector engines, and Fetch, and there are countless examples. But I think it just goes to show how good John Resig was at creating APIs. And when they got so popular and carried over into native world, that I think that's something to be proud of as a project.
Yeah, definitely. We, the jQuery project has greatly influenced standards. But to your point, Joy, I think that standards always move slowly and deliberately, both the web DOM standards and JavaScript, and they move so slowly that there are still things that have not yet been memorialized inside the DOM API that are proposed that are jQuery features. So, had the world needed to wait that long, 15 years, they wouldn't have wanted to wait that long. Some other solution had to be found, and jQuery was part of that.
Yeah, I guess having it in jQuery first, like you said, helped push the standards along, and allowed people, kind of like Babel is now, where someone has a proposal for ECMAScript, they can immediately write a Babel plugin for it, and you can start using it at stage 0. That's kind of the modern version, I think, of what jQuery was.
I think that's a great comparison. I hadn't actually thought about it that way. So, I think in addition to the standards impact and influence on standards, the other place I see personally jQuery's legacy at play is in just open source community. I'll share a little bit about my background. When I first got into open source, jQuery was the first community that I discovered. And it was mind blowing because there was this big team of people, and it was so welcoming, and there was the IRC channels and all of that kind of thing. And today, working with open source communities, it's so funny to see little things that we were doing with jQuery, that are now kind of common practice. More of an open governance style and things like that. I kind of wonder how you all think about how the open source community has evolved and kind of your initial foray into the project.
I think that we did pioneer a lot of that. And again, I think a lot of credit goes to John Resi, because he had a personality that was very much inviting and inclusive. And we just followed that pattern in creating, especially for the jQuery core team. I think, especially as you go through the life cycle of a project, if you go back, we've got hundreds of contributors to jQuery core, the majority of them the first 10 years when it was really actively being developed. And as you get to the point where fewer changes and the impact of changes are much more highly felt, I think you come up with a small group of people who have kind of gotten those battle scars, me, Timmy, Michal, trying to think of who else who is particularly active, Gibson, Richard Gibson. But you've got folks who have been around long enough to know they've stepped on the mines before. And so they don't tend to, be quite as quick to say, oh, well, let's just go change something. But that sometimes comes off to a community at this point in the evolution of jQuery. It sometimes comes off as being like not wanting contributions, but it's just more of a concern that as contributions come in, that the person making the proposal doesn't understand the impact. And we've tried to fix that problem by having documents in our wiki that talk about the criteria we use for deciding whether to make changes or not. I think that's helped some as well. But even like I said, being able to say no diplomatically, even for a growing project, is a very important thing, but it also tends to make contributors feel like, well, you don't want my stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like Mike Sheriff, I think, brought that up once, where he said he was just getting started, and he introduced a change, or he opened an issue, and then he opened a pull request,
Right.
And it was his first pull request on any project, and I ended up closing it and rewriting the patch and fixing it myself. But in that process, I think the whole team tried to be as diplomatic as possible and talk to him as we were making the changes. We just made the change a little faster and differently than he was expecting. But after that, Mike became one of our strongest contributors and a team member. And he's got plenty of patches landed himself now.
And he's also one of the people who I think has gotten that fear instilled in him when it comes to making changes. We were just talking about this on Twitter last week about how there's certain changes you go, oh, we can make this change, and you have to back it out. You say, oh, well, we could have made it if we did it this way. You do it again, and you back it out. So that's, I think, where, trying to create a community where people feel like they can ask for things, but also to explain to them why you're asking them to make changes or why the changes.
Yeah, I think it's easy for team members of a popular project to be offended when an issue opens, like just a little bit offended, and treat the poster in a way that isn't necessarily polite, or where you're already on the defensive. And so we had a policy to try to negate that, in that you always have to thank them for opening an issue. And starting from that state of mind helps you to be more accepting of possible issues, and not get defensive right away. And that was a community policy that I think has carried over to lots of other projects.
I think it certainly helps people feel more attracted and positive about, you know, the project, and not just the project, but also the things that the community did around it, right? Like the Learn website and the IRC channel and the events and things like that. Like, you know, and feel great about wearing the write less, do more swag and stuff like that. So, so I think about jQuery as kind of a prototypical kind of like, as a sort of a web standards historian, as one of the first projects that really started to try and like define what a successful open source project, a successful and great framework really was. Do you see jQuery as a great framework? Like, do you see it as sort of the pioneer that I do?
Tammy, do you want to take that first?
Sure. I guess I do. So I owe a lot of I owe my start to jQuery, really. So I guess I have a more personal connection than some people might to just a JavaScript library. So I was in class, in a computer science class. I think it was a database class, and someone from Chattanooga, a developer, came and spoke at our class and told everybody that they had to learn jQuery. And so I did, and I got really into the code, and I started looking at the issues, and I just picked a few and started, submitting pull requests. And eventually I submitted so many pull requests that John pulled me aside one day and just asked me if I wanted commit access, because he was tired of merging my pull requests. So I wore him down, and that's how I got on the team.
Good work.
Yeah. And being on the team is really, it's a good thing to have on a resume. But more than that, I think it's taught me a lot, working with great people like Dave and Michal and Richard and everybody. And I got to meet a lot of people, especially when there were jQuery conferences going on. There was a lot of amazing talent giving talks, and not even just attending. So it was really meaningful time for me, in my career. I don't know if I necessarily got the impact of jQuery at the time. Like, looking back, I'm kind of amazed at it.
Yeah, I obviously personally got a lot out of jQuery during all this time. I think that it's interesting you use the term framework, because I think jQuery is definitely not a framework. It's really more of a library, and that our desire to kind of keep jQuery as a focused library meant that people had to go elsewhere to find ways to structure bigger pages and applications. And you saw things like backbone out of that, where someone needed something that they could layer on top of jQuery. Ember actually was layered on top of jQuery. I don't know if they've removed it yet, but the first version of Angular had jQuery or a jQuery Lite in it. So there was a lot of frameworks that were built on top of jQuery in the early days, because the problem that jQuery was trying to solve of DOM manipulation and browser independence was particularly hard during those times. Not quite as much today, but even so, the simplicity and elegance of the jQuery library API itself is still worthwhile, even if you don't need it because you're not using IE11.
I think that's a great place to segue into like the continuing utility of jQuery. There's certainly been, like, it still powers a lot of the web. It still powers a lot of these frameworks that are still in use. It's still, one of those tools that is easy to just get started with, and I was looking at the HTTP archive data because it's just very mind-boggling to go look and see, okay, well, where are we at? Like, how many web pages are using jQuery? And their almanac from last year reported that it's in use by over 85% of desktop pages and 83% of mobile pages. That's a lot of web pages. So, I'm curious kind of how that data factors in for you all as you think about maintaining jQuery today and also maintaining it into its future.
Yeah, it's interesting. jQuery is still used a lot, especially if you consider like global usage. And I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think usage is even going up in China. But I don't know if anyone on the jQuery team really thinks of jQuery as a growing project. If you look at the data for what people are using in new projects, it might be different. Existing websites probably still have jQuery from being built years ago. But like, I don't personally use jQuery in my projects. I use React and Gatsby and Next.js and other things. So we don't have an evangelism team. We're not actively seeking to gain more users. We just want to take care of the users that we do have and maintain it well, keep the docs up to date, which is still plenty of work.
An incredible amount of work, unfortunately. Yeah, I think I would agree with Timmy there that we're not looking to grow our base, and obviously there's not a lot to grow from when you're at 85%. I think that one of the things that distorts people's perceptions about jQuery not really being a thing anymore is that a lot of the focus of developers is on building some of the most complex systems that run on web browsers. And those tend to be things that are using the newer frameworks. They're using React or Angular or Vue or Ember. And those are all very good ways to manage the complexity of something that has a huge amount of state that you need to keep track of. I can't imagine trying to write the Facebook site just using jQuery. But if you look at the majority of the content on the web, most of it is not really, doesn't have that much state. It's just kind of more reading type material. Probably the most complex stuff on the page are advertisements. And I'm not sure I really want to have people writing React advertisements. The thing that I think makes, like, especially if you're going to use React effectively and you want to use it like if you want to render on the back end for React, then that requires a complete re-architecting of your system. So if you look at all of the Drupal and WordPress and other existing backends out there, those really have already baked a lot of the state management and content management into that. And so when they push something down, an approach that jQuery has, like progressive enhancement, where you say, well, basically we have HTML here. We just need to add some things to make it a little more lively. jQuery is still a good solution for doing that. I think probably, I can certainly say in the work that I'm doing, it sounds like the work that Timmy's doing, that's not really the paradigm we're trying to follow for doing. But jQuery, obviously, if you're running a WordPress site, you're probably going to have jQuery there. And, trying to say, well, we're just going to throw that out and build a React application on top of WordPress is probably not the most effective way to solve the problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm recalling a quote from John Resig when he did an interview with JS Party. He said, I don't think we ever could have iterated on jQuery to the point at which we arrived at React or something like that. It's just a different branch of the evolutionary tree.
Right. And I think that was the same philosophy of not trying to evolve jQuery into a framework itself, although a few times people had asked us for that.
I think another thing is for a lot of folks learning to program, that it's still one of these tools that gets taught in boot camps and code schools and things like that. Because certainly for me, I think I found it very easy to learn and start to think about and reason about. This was a few years ago. And I think that's still true. Do you think that jQuery will always have a place for folks learning JavaScript?
I don't know about always. So historically, it's kind of been a mixed bag, I think. For instance, it bugs me sometimes to see jQuery on a resume instead of JavaScript, because it's really just JavaScript. It's just a JavaScript library. And I think there were a lot of beginners that, learned the jQuery API and didn't necessarily have an understanding of how JavaScript worked. They weren't familiar with prototypes or anything like native to the language exactly. And that you could obviously do for loops and things like that, except that's a funny example too, because oftentimes you end up using jQuery each instead of a for loop. And for instance, in the jQuery events, when you bind an event, the context, so this variable is the element itself and not the element wrapped in jQuery. And that was done intentionally because John thought that once you're in there, you more often than not would want to use the native element. But so often you'd see people just wrapping it in jQuery and continuing to use jQuery APIs instead of any standard native ones. So that's where I think jQuery maybe slows like how quickly you learn native JavaScript. On the other hand, jQuery, so there's a completely other side of that coin where jQuery gets a lot of people interested, or has gotten a lot of people interested, and made some things approachable and easy. Like the homepage of jQuery, I think, used to have a really simple animation that you could do with one call, where you just select an element and then show it, and it would animate out the text. And doing that with one line was really cool. And for beginners who just wanted to add a little something to their website, maybe animation or something else, they could use a plugin, and a lot of it was just copy paste development, and they could get things up and running really quickly. And that was sort of what got them into it. And then they started digging into the code and learning. So in that sense, it really helped people to learn JavaScript just as a spark.
I think it's, especially looking at the period of time when jQuery was created, 2005, 2006 timeframe, it was really difficult to do even simple animations, simple Ajax. A lot of that was, it all required a bunch of JavaScript, and people would create their own little custom libraries of various kinds that would sometimes only work for certain special cases. But now today, most of animations can be done with CSS and are be best done with CSS. Most of Ajax can be done with simple fetches and a few little odds and ends. But it's still relatively easy to do all of that with jQuery as well. It's just that even for those of us who like jQuery, we would prefer that people use the standards that are already there because they're more efficient, they're better on battery for mobile devices, those kind of things. So, we should expect things to evolve. That, you have a car from 1990, it's not going to be nearly as nice as a car. And it's not just the age of the car, it's all the features that have been put in the car. So you've got backup cameras and side view cameras and airbags. Really, jQuery was the right tool for that time, and it still has a lot of features that are useful today. Many parts of it that have been superseded by either CSS or JavaScript or DOM APIs that are meet time.
So you were speaking about like learning. I think we had one question from the audience about the difference between load, unload, and document.ready. And I think this is just more of a, can you explain it kind of question. One of you want to take that?
Yeah, why don't you start, Dave? I'll
right.
jump in if I...
So, yeah, there's one of the confusions about this is that there are events that occur. An event, when it occurs, if you're listening for it, you can react to it. It's like a tree falling in the forest, right? You don't hear it unless you're there. So document has been loaded event, the window on load. If you've attached an event before the window has finished loading, before the document is finished loading, you'll get an event delivered to your handler and you can do something. That comes pretty late in the process because that's after all the images and other things on the page have completely loaded. There's also, in the DOM world, there's an event called DOM content ready. And that occurs when the entire HTML document has been pulled in but potentially before any images or other things that are in the document have arrived. And again, you have to be listening for that event to be able to react to it. Both of those things are sometimes constraints that you don't want to have to deal with. So jQuery has a document ready API that says, I'm going to give you a function, and if the document's ready, call it. If the document becomes ready later, call it. So that eliminates the need to be there to watch the tree fall in the forest to hear it. You can just, at any point say, has the tree fallen? And if the tree's fallen, then it executes this function. That's probably the biggest benefit of document ready. But it still turns out that there's complications to that. There are things like people want to be able to run this code as quickly, as soon as possible, but no sooner. So if you want to be able to manipulate the document before it shows up on the screen so that you can avoid any flashing on the screen. Sometimes, even today, jQuery has issues where people use certain combinations of functionality, and it means that jQuery can't call your function quite as quickly as you might want it to be called. What do you have to add to that, Timmy?
So the simple answer is that the ready event happens sooner than the load event, and it means that the document is interactive. But that can happen before everything has loaded. So there might be more scripts or images loading. However, when you get down into the implementation of that, it can get really complicated because we can't actually use interactive all the time because there are still bugs in certain browsers that we support. So we try to use interactive where possible, I think. I can't remember. We've gone back and forth on this so many times because we just keep encountering bugs with it. What's that?
I said, this is a Mike Sheriff thing. But that's the one we were talking with him last week about.
Right. So we want users to be able to trust that document ready will happen as soon as possible in any browser that they're using, and that's a hard thing to guarantee. And there are still a couple of open issues about it after all this time. That said, most of the time it's fine, and it's just something that I would want to consult the jQuery source if I was going to do that natively, just to make sure I'm not missing the bugs. So there's an interesting conversation about whether you need jQuery, and this is a good example in that no, you don't necessarily need jQuery, but you might want to check if you need to fix these bugs as well.
That's actually a really great point. If you go to Stack Overflow, where people are answering tough questions about the DOM, even if it's not a jQuery question, somebody will say, well, you need to handle this case because if you look at the jQuery source, you'll see that this is, that we're having to deal with this.
So we're nearing the end of our allotted time, but to kind of wrap up, I was curious if we could talk a bit more about jQuery's future, which I think it's a good point that you make. The project's not attempting to grow, but it kind of is organically, especially in different geographic areas. Where do y'all see the project in the next, say, 5, 10, as it nears the end of its second decade? Where do you see the project going?
Poor Timmy.
Well, we do have a roadmap for jQuery core, and that's available on our GitHub and our wiki. That shows some of the plans we have for the project and documents them. One of the major things I think we want to do is change the infrastructure for our websites, or update it at least, because a lot of that stuff is really old and needs to be updated. We're going to continue maintaining the source code and the documentation as best we can. And I should point out that all of us on the jQuery team are volunteers with full-time jobs. So we don't always have very much time to spend on jQuery each week. Although recently, Michal, one of our team members, has been killing it.
He has. Shout out.
He's been doing a lot of the work that we've been wanting to do. And so I'm very grateful to him for that. He gets to spend, or his company donates some of his time. So he gets to spend a certain percentage of his time on open source. And he was focused on Angular for a while, but now he's back on jQuery. But anyway, in 5-10 years, I think jQuery will still be going strong. It might not, the usage will probably be down a bit globally, but it'll still be pretty high, and it'll still need to be maintained and supported. What do you think, Dave?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think jQuery, when you've got 85% usage across the internet, that's not going away anytime soon. So jQuery is not going anywhere. I think that the big challenge that jQuery has, which is really not necessarily up to the team, is to deal with the issues of security problems that are existing in other people's code that uses jQuery, potentially in jQuery itself. Problem is sometimes the changes can't be made without breaking existing code, and sometimes the breakage would be serious enough that that people would have to go into websites that haven't been updated for 5 years, and that's not going to be easy. So I think we, as a
right, and we can't just patch the latest version and stuff like that.
Right, people are, we can come out, we can update jQuery 3 or jQuery 4 or jQuery 5, but there'll still be a ton of people on jQuery 1 and 2.
Right.
And we've talked about trying to make some of the changes that are security issues there, but it's difficult because it does break existing code. And we need, we really don't, we're very serious about not breaking people's code. If they want to update, they can update. But the issue quite often is websites are written by people, and someone purchases, for example, a WordPress theme, and the theme, something that, that the person who bought it has no idea what it does, but it uses jQuery, and it uses an old version of jQuery. So, at some point that needs to be updated. I think that's a problem for a lot of ecosystems like Drupal and WordPress and several others that use jQuery as part of their system.
Right, and they have the same problem we have with backwards compatibility and needing to make incremental changes, very small changes, so that they don't upset the ecosystem too much. And part of that is not updating jQuery because we've made breaking changes and have moved on to major versions and dropped browser support for old browsers like IE 8 and 9 and I think 10 and coming up here for version 4. And that's not something WordPress necessarily wants to do just yet. And even if they did, it could take a long time for them to update.
sort of this cascading set of product management sort of strategies between like jQuery as the jQuery product, the WordPress product, the product of the theme builder, for example, and all that sort of stuff. And all of that has to kind of work together in order to somehow, in order to
Right.
not break.
And there's a lot of other platforms out there that use jQuery. I was involved in a bunch of nonprofit fundraising software a couple of years ago. There are 4 or 5 different systems that are all expecting to have jQuery there to build all of their donation pages. And that, you know, those are small enough systems that nobody's going to go back and reinvent and redesign all of those. It's just too much work. They're going to, if they're not actively developed, they'll have to age out somehow.
Mm-hmm. That's probably a bigger problem than we can solve.
It is.
You are a very smart, you're both very smart. So I do have all the faith that if anybody could solve it, you could, but probably not in your spare time, which to Timmy's point, you work on jQuery as volunteers. What is sort of a last question, what is it that the community can do, you know, to support y'all, to support the project? And, you know, what can we do? We users of consumers of jQuery.
Well, we're always looking for more contributors, and not necessarily in the code. It could be documentation or the websites, specifically the docs website or the homepage for jQuery.com. And that we have issues on GitHub that are labeled, I think it's help wanted. So that'd be a good place to start if you're looking to contribute. Otherwise, just moral support, I guess.
I definitely second the idea that we actually have been talking about completely changing our documentation platform, because it's a pretty old setup based off of XML and XSL. If you don't know what that is, then you're very fortunate. But we'd like to move to something a little more modern that would allow us, would allow contributors to contribute changes more easily, because right now it's pretty difficult to do that. Mm-hmm. The other thing people could do is update their versions of jQuery, especially if you're using jQuery 1 or 2. You know, try to update to a recent version of jQuery if you are using it, because, and we have tools like jQuery Migrate to make that easier, because those versions do have security bugs. They support browsers that no longer exist, so the versions tend to be smaller.
And if you're using jQuery Migrate, take it out for production.
Yes.
So sometimes we see that console log, jQuery Migrate has been loaded on production websites.
And people file bugs saying, please remove this so that nobody knows I'm doing it.
But it's just meant to be a development tool. But once you make the changes, it can be removed.
Very funny. Okay, well, I think that's probably a good question to end on there. Let me just thank both of you, Dave and Timmy, for dialing in today and chatting with us and sharing your experience with our broader OpenJS Foundation community. If you watched, please give Dave at Dave Methvin or at Timmy Will, you know, a nice little heart emoji on Twitter to show that support for all that they do for the web. You guys keep the web running, really. And I personally thank you. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and appreciate y'all tuning in. We'll see you for another AMA where you can ask us anything.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.
Of course.